Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brett. And this past June, I traveled to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil to study the informal settlements there, known as favelas. If you're not familiar with the term, favela is just the Portuguese word for slum. If you add a little more specific qualifiers to it, these are very high-density, low-income places, generally built along the urban fringes of the city. Thanks. You may be more familiar with the term from pop culture references, movies, video games, media coverage of the various goings-on there. More recently, maybe from the World Cup protests and controversy prior to June and July. And these are all very, very bold, sometimes sensationalist images, which kind of describes how favelas are generally seen, this very singular perspective. One of the friends I met in Vidigal in one of the favelas described to me her feelings on the World Cup as being that the cup is an enigma. It's something that in reality is a much more nuanced situation, and I think that this applies really well to the slums themselves in a similar way. A lot of people asked me why I was going to the slums of Brazil. Especially my parents. And to be honest, I've always been fascinated by this incredibly overwhelming level of density and all of these overlapping systems existing in one kind of colliding place. And I think that if you start to take these as systems that are not necessarily broken but simply different from the norm, it becomes an easier way to assess what they're actually like. Secondly, these are places that are growing. Slums are not going away, and so they're becoming increasingly relevant in our increasingly urbanized world. Every language has a word for slum in our culture. Excuse me. I think it's absolutely crucial that in the coming years we find a way to allow this level of density to exist in a humane and safe way, whether we're talking about the formal city or the informal. I'll kind of really quickly go over the history for the sake of time, but favelas were originally emerging in the late 19th century. They really grew as rural migrants from the outsides of the city came in to take jobs as industry grew in Rio de Janeiro. And today there are almost 1,000 slums or favelas within the state of Rio de Janeiro. These four really general conditions tend to emerge, including these precarious locations, sometimes built up on hillsides and really dramatic slopes. They're usually fairly isolated, whether physically or socially, from the rest of the city. There's a clear lack of regulation, and there's also a very clear necessity and demand for these places. In more general terms, it's divided into the favela and then the asphalt being the formal city that they refer to as the non-favela spaces. So this is a divide that can be seen throughout the city. You see it in varying relationships, sometimes really well integrated together, as you see in the North Zone. In the South Zone, where I was studying, these relationships are a bit more isolated from each other. You can see a much more dramatic contrast between this favela and the asphalt. Zona Sul is along the south edge of the city. It's home to the iconic beaches of Ipanema and Copacabana. And practically it was probably the easiest place to access as someone traveling alone to a very unfamiliar environment. But I was also interested in the really dramatic contrast that these favelas had with the neighborhoods around them, as well as with the landscape. If you've never seen this image, Rio de Janeiro is home to these really dramatic landforms throughout the city that really dictate how it's able to be formed. And the same holds true for the favelas. Throughout the South Zone, my focus was on the west end of the South Zone. It's called the Two Brothers Hill, which is home to Rocinha and Vidigal, the two locations I was studying. Rocinha being the largest and possibly the densest, possibly the most densest most dense and most populated in the city, was kind of a contrast to its relatively similar neighbor of Vidigal. Vidigal was a slightly smaller scale, a little bit more accessible. But the contrast between those two is nothing compared to the contrasts outside of these two settlements. Their neighbors of Salcanhada, Gavia, and Leblon are three of the most affluent areas in the entire state. They're also generally more suburban in nature, much less dense. And just as kind of a reference point, the estimates for Manhattan on a regular workday estimate about 170,000 people per square mile. Just the number of residents living in Hosina comes out to about 360,000 per square mile. So just to kind of see that very dramatic contrast with that and the rest in the neighborhoods around it. There's a very clear visual divide. It's further accentuated by the thresholds that exist between the favelas and the surrounding communities. And even from here, looking at, say, Leblon versus Vidigal, this is a very apparent difference in form and how the cities, or how the different areas are created. My time there, I was able to get a much more on-the-ground perspective of these places. And based on a series of observations over 3 weeks, I was kind of able to come up with this loose set of characteristics describing the more, say, successful components of the favelas. The first was this sort of adaptable series of resources. It started off as a very visual thing, just a series of sketches of different motifs that were repeated through the city, or through the favelas. But as you look through them, they become more indicative of some really positive attributes of the favela. Really tight resource management, for example. Really creative uses of poured concrete. You can see a lot of creative problem solving, as well as a sort of identity emerging through these visual cues. For example, in the rest of the city, barbed wire, razor wire is fairly prevalent, just as typical security measures. But this is practically non-existent in Hosina and Vidigal. It's often replaced by lots of color, lots of banners, lots of pride and identity within the community. Which leads to the second point, in which there are a lot of very passionate community leaders, organizations, focusing on the history and identity of the favelas, as well as focusing on the future of how they might develop. Vidigal in particular used a mapping method to promote local businesses in the community. There's a strong presence of nonprofit organizations or NGOs. There's also an especially strong arts and theater scene in the city. The third is a slightly different track, but within the favelas, these sort of informal microeconomies begin to emerge. First of all, based on the fact that the high density allows for a massive number of consumers to be available on a daily basis. As Hoda Samper notices, this allows what might normally be really inefficient business models to become very successful. They're usually very small scale, not formal, whether it's chickens, motorbikes, extended yard sales, or tourist attractions. At the top you can see the Cristo Redentor statue from the top of Hosina's favela. But no matter what it is, they all exist in this sort of shared street space, all really drawing off of that mixed-use development. As Greg Lindsay notes, this is not something that's exclusive to the slums, but it should be something we're actually modeling in our own cities. It should really be something that the sharing economy and purposeful cities are using as a model for themselves. So talking about the streets themselves, they're pretty roughly organized, some marked on maps, some not so much. But they all basically draw off of this main road, and then from there are dictated by the topography again. In Vidigal, which is a slightly smaller scale, these roads are fairly straightforward. You go from the main streets to smaller alleyways and courtyards, sometimes with staircases. Some of them are kind of blurry, whether it's private or public space, but Rocinha is much of the same. Although its main road is also home to a few bus routes and public transportation routes. So that increases the massive number of people inhabiting these streets, waiting for buses, but also interacting with people. Just walking through the favela on daily business. Again, as you go through and shrinking in scale, they become less accessible to vehicles, but much more pedestrian friendly. If tiny alleyways full of staircases and tight corners are friendly to anybody. But so what's really important to draw from this is that these aren't just static populations, they're very dynamic. And you're not just looking at a hierarchy of streets, but you're looking at how they actually direct the people within the favela. If you look, for example, you can see the main road curving through this portion of the neighborhood. The houses kind of are dictated again by this topography surrounding it. And on a daily basis, all of these people looking to that public transportation to go to their jobs or to go to the main street for commerce or for jobs within the favela, they're all drawn to that main road. And so this creates the streets not just as physical features, but as these facilitators of interaction, drawing all of that activity out into the streets. As Jen Jacobs might say, this creates a much safer community than you might see in a less populated area. When you have this massive amount of people, you have a sense of security in that. Excuse me. You have an entire community out there, interacting with each other, but also watching out for one another. It's kind of playing into this social drama, and really showing that the favelas exist as strong settlements themselves. And not only within the favela, but within the entire cultural landscape of Rio de Janeiro, these have a really strong cultural presence. So a quick disclaimer before I leave you guys. I just wanted to say that what I focused on was a very small component of a very large issue. And recognizing the complexity of that issue in no way means that someone fully understands it. And so if my project was successful at all, I would say it's successful as a very first step in a process of understanding. And I'll leave you with a quote from Jorge Celeron, so public artist in Brazil, who noted that living in a favela is like an art. It's something that you cannot discount the massive amount of lives converging all in this one place, and the amount of humanity created there. So despite their struggles, these are very dynamic and complex places to live and kind of deserve that recognition. Thank you for your time.